Every morning at exactly 6:42 a.m., a black luxury car stopped in front of a narrow apartment building that nobody noticed. The kind of building where paint peeled off the walls like old memories, where the elevator had been broken for 3 years, and where mailboxes hung open because nobody received anything worth stealing. And every single morning, without fail, a billionaire stepped out of that car. Not for a meeting, not for a press conference, not for any reason that made sense to anyone watching. He stepped out to walk a little boy to school, a boy whose mother cleaned his floors, a boy whose shoes had holes in the soles, a boy who carried a backpack held together by safety pins and prayers. What made a child ask such a powerful man for protection? And why did the man say yes when the truth could have destroyed them both? Stay with me, because this story doesn't begin with power. It begins with fear. The kind of fear that lives in the stomach of a 9-year-old boy who has learned that the world is not safe. The kind of fear that keeps you awake at night, listening for footsteps, counting the seconds between headlights passing your window. Who was this boy, really? Why did he no longer feel safe walking alone through streets he had known his entire life? What did the billionaire know that no one else did? And what secret was the child carrying that even his mother didn't know about? These are not small questions. These are the kinds of questions that change everything once you hear the answers. By the end of this story, you may never look at kindness, power, or children's silence the same way again. Because children are always watching, always listening, always carrying burdens that adults assume are too heavy for small shoulders. But here's what we forget. Children don't have a choice about what they witness. They can only choose what they do with it. And this boy, this quiet 9-year-old with 2 old eyes, had witnessed something that would unravel the lives of everyone around him. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your location in the comments, because we have viewers from all over the world, and I genuinely want to know who's here with me for this journey. If you're new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. We share stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Let me tell you about Grace. That wasn't the name her mother gave her, but it was the name she gave herself when she came to America 17 years ago with $43 in her pocket and a dream that felt too big to speak out loud. She chose Grace because she believed in the power of names. She believed that if she called herself Grace, maybe Grace would find her. Maybe kindness would recognize her. Maybe the world would be a little gentler to a woman who had already lost so much. Grace cleaned homes that weren't hers. She made beds she would never sleep in. She organized closets filled with clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. She wiped fingerprints off windows that overlooked gardens she wasn't allowed to walk through. And she did all of this with a smile. Not because she was weak. Not because she didn't feel the weight of inequality pressing down on her shoulders every single day. But because Grace understood something that many people never learn. Dignity is not something the world gives you. Dignity is something you carry with you, quietly, stubbornly, even when no one is watching. She had learned this lesson young. She had learned it in a village where women like her were told to be invisible. She had learned it in a factory where her fingers bled and no one cared. She had learned it on a boat crossing dark waters, where she held her breath for so long she forgot what it felt like to exhale. And now she was learning it again, in the marble hallways of homes owned by people who looked through her like she was made of glass. But Grace never complained. She never raised her voice. She never gave anyone a reason to notice her, because she had learned long ago that being noticed was dangerous. She had learned that attention could cost you everything. So she kept her head down. She kept her hands busy. And she kept her heart locked away where no one could break it. Except, of course, for her son. Her son was the one place where all of her locked-away love came pouring out. Her son was the reason she woke up at 4 a.m. and didn't go to sleep until midnight. Her son was the reason she kept going. Even when her feet burned and her back ached and her eyes stung with tears, she would never let fall. Eli was 9 years old. He had his mother's eyes, dark and deep like wells that held secrets at the bottom. He had her quiet way of moving through the world, as if he were trying not to disturb the air around him. But unlike Grace, who had learned to hide her observations behind a blank expression, Eli couldn't help but show his feelings. His face was an open book. When he was happy, his whole body seemed to light up from within. When he was sad, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to protect his heart. And when he was afraid, which was more often than anyone knew, his hands would tremble slightly, and he would press them against his thighs to make them stop. Eli was the kind of child who noticed things that adults ignored. He noticed when the cashier at the grocery store had been crying, even though she smiled, and asked if they'd found everything okay. He noticed when the old man who lived on the fourth floor stopped putting out food for the stray cats, and he understood without being told that the old man had died. He noticed when his mother flinched at loud noises, even though she always said she was fine. He noticed the way wealthy people looked at her, or rather, the way they didn't look at her. And he carried all of these observations inside himself like stones in his pockets, weighing him down with a knowledge that no 9-year-old should have to bear. Eli never complained. He understood without being told that complaining was a luxury they couldn't afford. He understood that his mother worked 2 jobs so that he could go to a good school, so that he could have opportunities she never had. He understood that every dollar she spent on him was a dollar she could have spent on herself, on the things that would have made her life a little easier, a little less exhausting. So he wore his shoes with holes in the soles without saying anything. He used pencils until they were too short to hold. He ate whatever she put in front of him and said thank you, even when he wasn't hungry, because he knew that his gratitude was one of the few gifts he could give her. Until one morning, he refused to put on his backpack. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't defiance. It was pure, paralyzing fear. Grace found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the backpack like it was a monster that might swallow him whole. His hands were shaking. His face was pale. And when she touched his shoulder and asked him what was wrong, he couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. It was as if something had crawled up his throat and died there, blocking everything he wanted to say. She thought maybe he was sick. She checked his forehead for fever. She asked if his stomach hurt, if his head hurt, if someone at school had been mean to him. But Eli just shook his head, over and over, his eyes fixed on the backpack. That morning, Grace had to call him late to work. She walked Eli to school herself, holding his hand the entire way, and she felt his fingers gripping hers so tightly that her knuckles ached. She watched him disappear through the school doors, and she stood there for a long moment, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't know what had changed. She didn't know what her son had seen or heard or felt. But she knew, with the instinct that only mothers have, that something was very, very wrong. The man Grace worked for was Mr. Harrington. Harold Harrington, to be precise, though no one called him Harold. He was the kind of man who inspired awe and unease in equal measure. His name appeared in Forbes, in business journals, in whispered conversations about power and influence. He had built his fortune from almost nothing, starting with a single rental property and expanding into an empire of real estate, technology investments, and ventures that most people couldn't even understand. At 63 years old, he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had a house with 37 rooms, most of which he never entered. He had a collection of cars he never drove, art he never looked at, and wine he never drank. He had everything, and he had nothing. His wife had died 4 years earlier. Cancer, the slow, cruel kind that lets you watch someone you love disappear piece by piece. He had sat by her bedside for 7 months, watching her fade, and when she finally slipped away, something in him had slipped away too. He stopped attending board meetings. He stopped returning phone calls. He stopped caring about the empire he had built. Now he spent most of his days in his study, surrounded by books he didn't read and photographs he couldn't look at without feeling like someone was tearing out his heart. He was respected. He was feared. He was one of the most powerful men in the city. But he was also profoundly, devastatingly alone. Grace had worked for him for 3 years. In all that time, he had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times. Short, polite exchanges. Instructions about the cleaning. Comments about the weather. Once, when she had knocked over a vase and stood there trembling, waiting for him to yell, he had simply said, "Don't worry about it. It was ugly anyway." That was the closest they had ever come to a real conversation. Grace didn't expect anything more. She understood her place in his world. She was the help. She was invisible, and that was fine with her. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant she could do her job, collect her paycheck, and go home to her son without any complications. But then came the evening that changed everything. Grace was staying late to finish cleaning the east wing of the house. Mr. Harrington had a dinner party the next day, and every surface needed to be spotless. Every floor needed to shine. Every piece of silver needed to gleam. Eli was with her because she couldn't afford a babysitter, and the elderly neighbor who usually watched him was in the hospital. So Eli sat in the corner of the kitchen, doing his homework, trying to be as quiet and invisible as his mother had taught him to be. He was good at being invisible. Too good, really. So good that he often disappeared into corners where people forgot he was there. And that night, in the vast kitchen of Mr. Harrington's mansion, Eli was invisible enough to witness something he wasn't supposed to see. But that's not what changed everything. What changed everything was what happened afterward. What changed everything was a whispered conversation that Mr. Harrington happened to overhear as he passed by the kitchen door. Grace was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor near the walk-in pantry, when she heard Eli's voice. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to someone else. Her heart stopped. There was no one else in the kitchen. Slowly, carefully, she set down her cloth and crept toward the sound of her son's voice. And then she saw him. He was standing near the window, his back to her, his small body silhouetted against the evening light. He was talking to Mr. Harrington. Mr. Harrington was standing just inside the doorway, his face hidden in shadow, his posture stiff with the awkwardness of a man who was not used to speaking with children. And Eli was looking up at him with those two old eyes, saying words that made Grace's blood run cold. Please, can you walk me tomorrow? Not to his mother. Not to anyone who made sense. To the billionaire. To the man who owned this house, who employed his mother, who lived in a world so different from theirs that it might as well have been a different planet. Grace dropped the cloth she was holding. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. She wanted to run to her son, to grab him, to apologize to Mr. Harrington for her son's boldness. She wanted to explain that Eli was just a child, that he didn't understand how things worked, that she would talk to him and make sure he never overstepped again. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Because before she could say anything, before she could apologize or explain or beg for forgiveness, Mr. Harrington did something unexpected. He knelt down. This man, this billionaire, this titan of industry who had shaken hands with presidents and kings, got down on one knee so that he was at eye level with a 9-year-old boy in worn-out clothes. And he said, quietly, in a voice that Grace had never heard him use before, a voice that was soft and gentle and somehow wounded, "Why?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace held her breath. Eli hesitated. She could see his hands trembling at his sides. She could see the fear in his eyes, the desperate need to be believed, the terror of speaking a truth that had been locked inside him for too long. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, Eli said, "Because the man in the blue truck waits for me." The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a peaceful moment, but the heavy, crushing silence of something terrible being revealed. Grace felt her knees buckle. She grabbed the edge of a counter to keep herself upright. A man in a blue truck, waiting for her son. How long had this been happening? Why hadn't Eli told her? Why had he kept this secret locked inside himself, carrying it alone, until the weight of it became too much to bear? And why, of all people, had he asked Mr. Harrington for help? The answer came to her slowly, like a sunrise creeping over the horizon. Because Mr. Harrington was powerful. Because Mr. Harrington could protect him in ways that she couldn't. Because Eli, in his quiet, observant way, had understood something that many adults never grasp. Sometimes the only thing that stops a predator is a bigger predator. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known a child who was carrying a secret they couldn't tell? Have you ever looked into a young person's eyes and sensed that something was wrong, even when they smiled and said they were fine? Children are remarkably good at hiding their pain. They learn early that adults are busy, distracted, overwhelmed. They learn that their problems are often dismissed as silly or exaggerated. They learn that asking for help sometimes makes things worse, not better. So they stay quiet. They carry their burdens alone. And sometimes, when the weight becomes unbearable, they reach out in unexpected ways. They ask for help from strangers. They speak their truths to people who might actually listen. If you've ever been that person, the person a child trusted with their fear, type, "I've been there" in the comments. And if you've ever been that child, the one carrying a secret too heavy to speak, I want you to know that this story is for you. Mr. Harrington did not hesitate. He did not ask follow-up questions. He did not make phone calls or consult with lawyers or do any of the things that powerful people usually do when confronted with problems they don't want to deal with. He simply said, "I'll be here at 6:30 tomorrow morning." And he was. The next morning, at exactly 6:30, the black luxury car pulled up outside Grace's apartment building. Mr. Harrington stepped out, dressed in a casual suit that probably cost more than Grace's yearly salary. He looked uncomfortable, out of place in this neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and overflowing dumpsters. But he was there. He waited by the front door of the building, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air, until Grace and Eli emerged. Grace didn't know what to say. She had spent the entire night rehearsing speeches of gratitude, explanations, apologies. But when she saw Mr. Harrington standing there, all of her words evaporated. He nodded at her. A simple acknowledgement. No judgment. No expectations. And then he looked at Eli and said, "Ready?" Eli nodded, his eyes wide with something that might have been hope. They walked to school together. Mr. Harrington and the maid's son. The billionaire and the boy in worn-out shoes. They walked in silence, mostly, though occasionally Mr. Harrington would ask simple questions. About school. About Eli's favorite subjects. About what he wanted to be when he grew up. And Eli answered, shyly at first, then with growing confidence. Grace walked behind them, watching, her heart aching with emotions she couldn't name. Gratitude, fear, confusion, hope, and something else, something that felt almost like witnessing a miracle. When they reached the school, Mr. Harrington stopped at the gate. He did not go inside. He did not make a scene. He simply stood there, tall and imposing, and watched as Eli walked through the doors. And then he turned and walked back to his car, and Grace never saw the blue truck that day, or the day after, or the day after that. Every morning for the next 3 weeks, Mr. Harrington arrived at 6:30. Every morning, he walked Eli to school. And every morning, the blue truck was absent from the streets near Eli's school. But other things began to appear. Whispers, stares, questions that nobody asked directly, but that hung in the air like cigarette smoke. The other parents at the school noticed. Of course they did. A black luxury car. A billionaire. A maid's son. It didn't make sense, and people hate things that don't make sense. They want explanations, narratives, stories that fit into the boxes they've already built in their minds. And when they can't find those stories, they invent them. The rumors started small. Maybe he's the father. Maybe there's something inappropriate going on. Maybe the maid is blackmailing him. Maybe the kid knows something. The rumors grew larger, uglier, more vicious with each passing day. Grace heard them in the grocery store, in the laundromat, in the stairwell of her apartment building. She heard the whispered accusations, the raised eyebrows, the knowing glances exchanged between people who had no idea what they were talking about. She wanted to scream at them. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell them that Mr. Harrington was simply being kind, that he was protecting a child who needed protection, that there was nothing scandalous or sinister about any of it. But she knew that screaming and explaining would only make things worse. So she stayed quiet. She kept her head down. She kept going to work, kept cleaning floors, kept holding her son's hand and telling him that everything would be okay. But inside, she was terrified. What if the rumors reached Mr. Harrington's business partners? What if they damaged his reputation? What if he decided that helping her son wasn't worth the cost? And underneath all of that fear, there was another fear, deeper and darker and older. A fear that she had carried with her for 9 years. A fear that she had never spoken out loud, not even to herself. Because there was something she had never told Eli. Something about his father. Something dangerous. Let me tell you about the man in the blue truck. For 3 weeks, he didn't appear. The streets near Eli's school were quiet, peaceful, safe. But Grace knew, in her bones, that he was still out there. Men like that don't give up easily. They wait. They watch. They bide their time. And then, when you finally let down your guard, when you finally started to believe that the danger has passed, they strike. Grace had been running from men like that for Eli's entire life. It had started before he was born, back when she was young and foolish and believed that love could conquer anything. She had trusted the wrong person. She had given her heart to someone who only wanted to use it. And by the time she realized her mistake, it was too late. She was pregnant, alone, and trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She escaped, eventually. It took years. It took sacrifice. It took leaving behind everything and everyone she had ever known. But she escaped, and she thought she was safe. She thought she had hidden well enough, traveled far enough, changed enough about herself that the past could never find her. But she was wrong. The past always finds you. It's patient. It's persistent. It never forgets. And now, after 9 years of running, the past had found her again. It had found her in the form of a blue truck that waited outside her son's school. It had found her in the form of a private investigator who had been searching for Eli since the day he was born. And it had found her in the form of a secret that was about to explode into the light. On a rainy morning, exactly 4 weeks after Mr. Harrington started walking Eli to school, he didn't show up. Grace stood by the window of her apartment, watching the street, waiting for the black car that always arrived at 6:30. But 6:30 came and went. Then 6:45. Then 7 o'clock. The car didn't come. Eli was sitting at the kitchen table, his backpack on, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't crying, but his face was pale, and his eyes had that haunted look that Grace hated seeing. Maybe he's sick, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Maybe he had a meeting. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Mr. Harrington had never missed a morning. Not once. Not even when he had a cold. Not even when it was pouring rain. Something was wrong. And then she heard it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Heavy footsteps. Official footsteps. The kind of footsteps that belong to people who are about to deliver bad news. She knew, before she opened the door, that everything was about to change. She knew, with the instinct that had kept her alive for so many years, that the running was finally over. The knock came. 3 sharp raps on the door. Grace took a deep breath, pressed her hand against her chest to steady her racing heart, and opened the door. There were 2 police officers standing in the hallway. Behind them, wearing a rumpled suit and an expression of exhausted triumph, was a man she had never seen before. And behind him, standing in the shadows at the end of the hall, was Mr. Harrington. His face was pale. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. And in that moment, looking at him, Grace understood. He knew. He had known all along. "Ma'am," the police officer said, "we need to ask you some questions about your son." Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice was trapped somewhere deep in her chest, locked behind walls of fear and secrets and 9 years of running. She looked at Eli, who was still sitting at the kitchen table, his small face pale and terrified. She wanted to run to him, to scoop him up in her arms and run away, to disappear into the night like she had done so many times before. But her feet wouldn't move. Her body was frozen, and all she could do was stand there, waiting for the truth to finally, inevitably, come out. The man in the rumpled suit introduced himself as Detective Morrison. He had been working a case, he explained, for almost a decade. A cold case. A missing persons case. A case involving a child who had disappeared 9 years ago. A boy who was born into one of the wealthiest families in the country. A boy who was taken from a hospital 3 days after his birth and never seen again. Grace felt the room spinning around her. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. Detective Morrison continued speaking, his voice flat and professional, reciting facts like items on a shopping list. The child had a distinctive birthmark. A small, crescent-shaped mark on his left shoulder blade. The family had never stopped searching. They had hired investigators, offered rewards, followed every lead no matter how unlikely. And 6 months ago, one of those leads had finally paid off. A private investigator named Robert Chen had been hired by the family to follow up on a tip. A tip about a woman who matched the description of a nurse who had been working at the hospital the night the child disappeared. A woman who had left the country shortly afterward. A woman who had reappeared in America 17 years later with a young son who had a crescent-shaped birthmark on his left shoulder blade. The blue truck, Detective Morrison explained, belonged to Robert Chen. He hadn't been stalking Eli. He had been watching him, gathering evidence, trying to confirm whether this boy was the missing heir before approaching the authorities. Grace felt her legs give out beneath her. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes blurry with tears she couldn't stop. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She had been so careful. She had covered her tracks. She had created a new identity, a new life, a new story. And she had told herself, every day for 9 years, that she was protecting Eli, that she was giving him a better life than the one he would have had, that she was saving him from people who would have used him, exploited him, turned him into a pawn in their games of power and wealth. But had she been protecting him? Or had she been running from her own sins? The truth, when it finally came out, was more complicated than anyone expected. Grace wasn't Eli's biological mother. She had been a nurse at the hospital where he was born. She had watched his parents, wealthy and powerful and cold, discussing their newborn son like he was a business acquisition. She had heard them talk about trust funds and inheritance clauses and strategic marriages. She had seen the way they looked at their own child, not with love, but with calculation. And on the third night, when the baby wouldn't stop crying and no one came to check on him, she had made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She took him. She wrapped him in a blanket, walked out of the hospital, and disappeared into the night. She told herself she was saving him. She told herself she was giving him the chance to grow up loved, really loved, not as a chess piece in some wealthy family's power game. She told herself that what she did was justified, necessary, even noble. But now, looking at her son's terrified face, she wasn't sure anymore. Had she saved him, or had she stolen him? Had she given him love, or had she robbed him of his birthright? And did any of it matter now that the truth was finally out? She turned to Mr. Harrington, who was still standing in the hallway, his face unreadable. "You knew," she whispered. "From the beginning. You knew." He nodded slowly. "I suspected," he said. "From the first day you started working for me. There was something about the boy, the way he carried himself, the way he looked at the world. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt familiar." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost tender. "I knew his family, you see, the Worthingtons. I did business with them years ago, and when I saw Eli, I remembered something. A birthmark, a crescent moon on the left shoulder. I remembered because Martin Worthington had the same mark. His father had it too. It runs in the family." Grace stared at him. "Then why didn't you turn me in? Why didn't you call the police the moment you suspected?" Mr. Harrington was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I watched you with him. I watched the way you looked at him, the way you held him, the way you sacrificed everything for him. And I realized something. I realized that you loved him, really loved him, in a way that his biological parents never would." He paused. "I lost my wife 4 years ago. Before she died, she told me that love isn't about blood or genetics or legal documents. Love is about showing up. Every day, even when it's hard, even when it costs you everything." Mr. Harrington looked at Eli, who was still sitting at the table, his eyes wide and confused. "You showed up for him every day? You gave him everything you had. And when he asked me to walk him to school, I saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear of a stalker. Fear of being taken away from the only mother he had ever known." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. But the blue truck, the man watching him, he was terrified. "I know," Mr. Harrington said. "That's why I agreed to help. Not because I was trying to protect him from danger, but because I was trying to buy time." "Time for what?" "Time to find a solution. Time to figure out a way to protect both of you." Detective Morrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrington has been in contact with us for several weeks," he said. "He's been working behind the scenes to negotiate an arrangement with the Worthington family." Grace's heart stopped. "An arrangement?" The detective nodded. "The Worthingtons don't want a scandal. They don't want their family name dragged through the courts and the tabloids. And frankly, after 9 years, they're not particularly interested in raising a child they don't know." Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Then what do they want?" "They want to know he's safe. They want to know he's being cared for. And they want a legal arrangement that protects everyone involved." The detective paused. "Mr. Harrington has offered to become Eli's legal guardian. A joint custody arrangement. He'll provide for Eli's education, his health care, his future. And you'll remain in his life as his mother in every way that matters." Grace looked at Mr. Harrington, her vision blurred by tears. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this? You barely know us." Mr. Harrington smiled, and for the first time, Grace saw something soft in his eyes. Something wounded and healed at the same time. "Because my wife always wanted children," he said. "And I always told her we'd have them someday. But someday never came. She died before we could make that dream come true." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't get her back. I can't change the past. But I can do something now. Something that matters. Something that would have made her proud. Let me pause here and ask you to really think about this. What would you have done in Grace's position? She took a child from parents who had the legal right to him, but perhaps not the moral right. She gave him 9 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion. She broke the law, but did she do the wrong thing? And what about Mr. Harrington? He could have turned her in the moment he suspected. He could have called the police, collected whatever reward was offered, and walked away with his conscience clear. Instead, he chose to protect a woman and child who had no claim on his help. He chose to risk his reputation, his business, his entire life, for people who were essentially strangers. Is that foolishness, or is it grace? I want you to sit with that question for a moment. Type your answer in the comments. I really want to know what you think. Eli wasn't told the full truth that day. He was too young to understand the complexity of what had happened, the legal negotiations, the family politics, the tangled web of lies and love that had brought them to this moment. But he understood the most important thing. He understood that he was loved, not just by Grace, who had given up everything for him, not just by Mr. Harrington, who had stepped in to protect him from dangers he didn't even know existed, but by the universe itself, which had somehow conspired to bring these three broken people together. Over the following months, things changed. Grace kept working for Mr. Harrington, but her role shifted. She was no longer just the help. She was family. She moved into a small cottage on the grounds of his estate, a beautiful little house with a garden and a room for Eli that had windows overlooking the trees. Eli went to a better school. He had new shoes, new books, a backpack that didn't need safety pins to hold it together. He had tutors and music lessons and summer camps. He had opportunities that Grace could never have given him on her own. But more importantly, he had something that no amount of money could buy. He had peace. He had safety. He had the knowledge that when he woke up scared in the middle of the night, there would always be someone there to hold his hand. The nightmares didn't stop immediately. For months, Eli would wake up sweating, crying, convinced that the man in the blue truck was coming to take him away. But gradually, slowly, the nightmares became less frequent. And eventually, they stopped altogether. Mr. Harrington, for his part, found something he hadn't expected. Purpose. For the first time since his wife's death, he had a reason to get out of bed in the morning. He had someone to care for, someone to protect, someone who looked at him with trust and hope instead of fear or greed. He started taking Eli to baseball games, to museums, to fishing trips at a lake house he hadn't visited in years. He taught him how to ride a bike, how to tie a tie, how to shake hands like a man. And in doing so, he healed. Not completely. The wound of his wife's death would never fully close. But it became bearable. It became something he could carry without being crushed by it. 3 years after that rainy morning, when the police came to Grace's door, Eli turned 12. They threw him a party at the estate, with balloons and cake and presents piled high on a table decorated with streamers. Grace watched from the corner of the room, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Mr. Harrington stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face. "You know," he said quietly, "my wife used to say that the best things in life are the ones you never planned for." Grace nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he said. "She would have loved him. She would have loved both of you." Grace looked at Eli, who was laughing with his friends, his face bright with joy. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Mr. Harrington shook his head. "You already have. Every morning when I see him smile, every night when I know he's safe, you repay me 1,000 times over." There's a lesson in this story, and it's not the one you might expect. It's not about billionaires rescuing the poor. It's not about crime and punishment or the complexities of adoption law. It's about something much simpler and much more profound. It's about the fact that love doesn't follow rules. Love doesn't care about blood or money or social status. Love finds people where they are, broken and scared and desperately hoping for something better. And when love finds them, it holds on. It shows up. Every single day, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, even when the world says it shouldn't exist. Eli is 22 now. He graduated from college last spring with a degree in social work. He wants to help children like himself, children who are lost between worlds, children who carry secrets too heavy for their small shoulders. Grace is still on the estate, though she's retired now. She spends her days in the garden, growing flowers and vegetables, watching the birds that nest in the trees outside her window. She's at peace. Finally, after a lifetime of running, she's at peace. And Mr. Harrington is 76. His hair is white now, and he walks with a cane, but his eyes are still sharp. He still has breakfast with Eli every Sunday morning. He still tells him stories about his wife, about the dreams they had, about the life they never got to live together. And sometimes, when the light is just right and the morning fog is lifting from the grounds, he swears he can feel her there with them, watching, smiling, proud. So let me ask you one final question. If a child trusted you with their fear, would you kneel to listen? If power crossed your path, Would you use it quietly or loudly? The world is full of children carrying secrets. It's full of mothers running from shadows. It's full of lonely souls who have everything and nothing at the same time. And it's full of moments, small and quiet and easily missed, where we have the chance to show up for someone. The chance to walk them to school. The chance to say, I believe you. The chance to change everything. I hope this story stays with you. I hope it makes you think about the children in your life, the secrets they might be carrying, the fears they might be hiding behind their smiles. I hope it makes you think about the power you have, whatever form that power takes, and how you choose to use it. Leave a comment below with one word that this story awakened in you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories like this, stories that breathe and ache and stay with you long after the screen goes dark, matter to your heart, then subscribe to this channel and walk with us again. There's always another tale waiting. Another story that needs to be told. Another truth hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. The next story begins where this one ends. Where silence becomes speech. Where fear becomes hope. Where strangers become family. Until next time.